This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me today is my regular co-host now going forward, Clara Cook. Hi Clara.
Hi Duncan.
And we have a very special guest with us this week. We have Kay Shaw from To the Journey.
Hi Duncan.
Hi. I was hoping for, echoes of To the Journey. I know you don't do that these days, but
we don't.
I missed that.
We don't,
I think you should bring that back. I thought Clara might give me a little To the Journey. Anyway, it's great to have you on board, Kay. It's great to have you on board for this discussion. The topic we are looking at this week is LGBT representation in Star Trek. And in a way, it's a good thing that we can even say representation, because I think if we were having this conversation, a few months ago, we might be saying LGBT non-representation in Star Trek, because that's a big part of this issue. But obviously, this has been a very contentious, a very emotive issue for a lot of Star Trek fans going back, a number of decades to, I remember when I sort of first got into Star Trek in the 90s, this was something that was in the air then and never quite was dealt with really satisfactorily. And only, recently have we seen a bit more effort to tackle it. And then in the last few weeks, we've had a real kind of controversy, I suppose, about Discovery and where they seem to be going with certain storylines and alienating certain fans. So it seems like it's still an issue that is definitely possible for Star Trek to get wrong.
So one of the questions I had was Star Trek seemed to be ahead of its time in terms of social change, especially in the 1960s, with representing different ethnic backgrounds. So, for instance, Sulu on the bridge, Chekhov on the bridge. And of course, there was that idea of possibly having a female commander, number one. And going forward, it seemed to be ahead of in a lot of issues. There was a disabled crew member when we think of Geordie LaForge. Then there was Sisko, who was like a black commander. And then Janeway, obviously, who's a woman in a leadership role. So why is it, do you think, that perhaps, not perhaps, but why is it, do you think, definitely Star Trek is so behind when it comes to representing the LGBT community on screen?
It's a really good question, actually, Clara. And I'm not sure I have a really coherent answer to that, because I know that certainly, as we all know, on British TV, things came somewhat sooner than they had in Star Trek. And you're absolutely right. Representation in pretty much every other area you could think of absolutely is there at a time ahead of a lot of other media. So I don't really quite understand. I don't know whether it's a conservative thing, whether it's sort of a media thing in general in the States as opposed to the UK, something like that. I don't really know, but you're absolutely right. It is definitely behind in terms of the social progress of the rest of what we see in the show.
There was always this sort of anxiety that, it would put people off and they'd get complaint letters from, mums in middle America and so on, wasn't there? Yeah. But I just don't know. You're right. You say British TV, it's true. We had towards the end of the 90s, I guess we had Queer as Folk, we had Brookside in the sort of mid 90s, I think. But American TV as well, we had, I know it was it was a huge big deal when Ellen came out on her show, but, that was in the, that would be sort of mid-90s, I think. You had shows like Will and Grace, even, in the world of kind of light entertainment and comedy and so on. It seemed like it was becoming much more normal to see gay characters on TV. And yet Star Trek continued to kind of skirt around this issue for a long time. They would deal with these issues allegorically, but there was this kind of real anxiety about ever actually, showing a gay couple, showing a gay character.
I think the allegorical attempt to talk about gay relationships and homosexual relationships and the LGBT community, in the Star Trek's attempt to try and talk about it in different ways, I actually think wasn't massively effective. Well, for number one, they should have shown an LGBT person, a character in the show to begin with. But then even if they didn't feel that they could do that at that time, the attempt to sort of tell a story but in a veiled way wasn't very good. And I think of some of the examples, some of the episodes that we have, like The Outcast, Rejoined, Stigma. An example is Stigma, which is like an attempt to sort of deal with the story of a disease that is caught and spread amongst a particular group of people. And they were trying to sort of link that to AIDS and the gay community, which I think is, in a way, slightly insulting, because it's the idea that only people who are gay get AIDS, and that's not true. AIDS is something that everybody should be concerned about. So the episode was preaching inclusivity and preaching like equality and acceptance of a community that is different and is behaving differently and therefore suffering from the fallout of an illness or a disease. I don't think it fits with the AIDS metaphor. Like, so that's just one example, but another example would be Rejoined or The Outcast. I mean, what do you guys think of those episodes? Do you think they address or explore LGBT issues effectively?
I think The Outcast, whilst the message is definitely there, and the positive message of, we are like everybody else, we live our lives in many of the same ways as you do, we're not something to be feared or looked at differently. I think it kind of fails in the sense that at the end, they, in inverted commas, cure her, and there's not a positive outcome from it. I think if they'd have gone for a more positive outcome, I think it would have been more effective. But the gay message is very veiled there, because obviously we're not really talking about sexuality, we're talking about gender, which is a different issue, even though the two can be related. But they're going for like the gay rights message there. That was very explicitly what the writers stated they were doing with that episode, if you look into the background of it. So I think it kind of succeeds in some ways, but in other ways it falls a bit flat. So they tried, but it doesn't quite get all of the way there for me.
I mean, personally, for me, I feel like individually, I actually have more time for those episodes than I think a lot of people do. And I don't know if that's partly from sort of going back to, my memories of watching them in the 90s in part. I mean, I do think there's an issue that, there is this kind of trope with gay representation on TV of kind of having these sort of tragic stories that never have a happy end ever after ending. And I certainly felt that. I felt that today, watching these episodes back to back, it really put a downer on my day, basically, because all of these episodes, they have the same tragic ending. Basically, you have this romance that you're rooting for. You want these people to get together, and then it goes horribly wrong and it's all awful. And and they always end with someone sort of looking, pained at the camera and you kind of empathizing with their misery. So I get the objection from that point of view. On the other hand, I think they're both quite moving in a way. I mean, they do sort of make their case. I think, say, The Outcast, the character in that, Soren, gives this quite sort of powerful speech. It's, it's a Shylock speech, basically. It's saying, we're the same as you. We do the same things you do. She says, we worry about growing old. We talk about our families and how they're annoying us. I mean, I think that in some ways it's kind of simplistic, but at the same time, it is making an important point. And it may be a point that members of the audience might, take something from that they wouldn't have taken in a way. And I think Rejoined, again, is, I understand why people have issues with it and they sort of feel like, well, yeah, they're doing the gay story, but they were straight in a previous life, so it's not really a gay story. And it's got all this kind of hedging going on. On the other hand, I also sort of think, Star Trek has always used allegory. I mean, like, it wasn't subtle in the original series when they had the people with black and white sides of their face, but it doesn't mean it didn't necessarily do some kind of good work in terms of making people think or kind of opening something up. And I do think that in Rejoined, there are a lot of good things in that episode. And I think that it is just purely as a piece of drama. I mean, if you take away this thing of, why does it always have to have a tragic ending? If you just take that as an episode on its own and, see it in the context of Deep Space Nine, a lot of Deep Space Nine has tragic endings. Deep Space Nine is all about sort of loss and pain and difficulties and things not working out and so on. And I think sort of as a Deep Space Nine episode or just as a piece of television, it's really good. I mean, on its own terms, I think it's very dramatic. It's kind of heartbreaking. It's, it's very well acted, very well directed. So I sort of feel like my personal feeling is that sometimes these episodes are given a bit of a hard time because yes, we would prefer that they went further, and yes, we would prefer that they took the more straightforward step of actually having gay characters, which, you know, up until Discovery, well, up until Beyond, I suppose, but, you know, properly up until Discovery, they haven't done. At the same time, if you take them as these kind of allegorical stories, I think they're good Star Trek in a way, even if they're not necessarily serving the interests of that community as well as they might be doing. It's
sort of like Star Trek's whispering about sexual equality, and then it's only recently that Star Trek's actually started speaking out loud about it with Discovery. I do agree with you on one point, which is I do think that Star Trek has repeatedly done this situation where it's presenting like episodes like the Outcast and Stigma of mostly focusing on the discrimination of people who engage in sexual behavior that is deemed to be outside their society. So in a way, it's never allowing like a gay storyline to be a storyline where there's someone who's gay and it's okay and they're just gay and they're living a normal life, like Culber and Stamets brushing their teeth, you know? And also what I liked about that couple in Discovery is that their sexual identity isn't the only thing about them. Stamets is interested in science. Culber is passionate about being a good doctor. And the fact that they're both gay isn't like the sole thing about their identity. Whereas you often see gay characters on television or in films, and it's like they're wearing a big neon sign above their heads that say, you know, I'm the gay character. And I think that's doing I think that's doing the LGBT community a disservice, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you wouldn't expect a straight character to be walking around with a sign saying, I'm the straight character. And it's exactly as ridiculous as that. That's how I see it anyway. But I totally agree with you on what's happening now in Discovery. You know, it's great to see the fact that we have that there, and ignoring what's happened in the last couple of episodes, just to talk about what happened before that, because I think we'll get onto that a little bit later. But it's just nice to see that there and it just being and just existing. And it's not part of the storyline, really, at all. It's nothing to do with what's going on in the story any more than Lorca and Cornwell's relationship, which is probably more to do with the story. And you know, Tyler and Burnham's relationship, which is more to do with the story, because both of those do have elements to do with what's going on in the story. But it's just, it's there, it exists, it's a thing, they're in a relationship, and it's just very organic. So I appreciate that a lot in that way, that really they didn't draw masses of attention to it. And I did hear a couple of people, when they had the first kind of teeth brushing scene, there were various people saying, oh, why didn't they have a kiss? Why didn't they have a kiss? And all this type of thing. And I'm like, no, I'm really glad they didn't, because, you know, people don't kiss when they're brushing their teeth. Yeah. They're just brushing their teeth. Let's just see them doing that. Let's not just have a kiss, because if you'd done that, you would have made it into something that you were highlighting, whereas they didn't make it into something they were highlighting. It was no different to what you'd see if you were just seeing a scene in a bathroom that was part of the plot and the person's partner happened to be there, which is what it was. It's almost, you know, what we should have got with Miles and Keiko O'Brien, a kind of normal, functional relationship. Do you know what I mean? Because it's not, they might argue about this or that or whatever, but there is no real kind of huge drama around their relationship. It's not, you know, even Dax and Worf or Tom and B'Elanna, or, you know, one of these sort of fiery, tempestuous relationships. It is a much more real relationship in a sense. And that was obviously quite a calculated decision, I think, to introduce that relationship through something so kind of ordinary and everyday. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen people brush their teeth on Star Trek before. You know, it's extremely mundane. And that's definitely a decision to try and say, look, this is, you know, just as normal as it would be for anyone else. It's not a big deal. We're not, you know, yes, we're the show that's doing the gay character, or the gay characters, but we're not kind of making a big deal out of it. Frankly, the time for making a big deal out of it would have been 20 years ago. And, you know, if they did make a big thing out of that now, I think it would seem kind of silly in a way, because they're so behind the curve.
So one of the things that struck me as very strange is my reaction to some of these episodes, watching them now in 2018 versus when I watched them back in the 90s when I was younger. So in my own experience, I would say I am much more aware of like the LGBT community now than I was when I was younger. And part of that is because of the movement of LGBT rights and the ground that's been gained there, but also just the fact that I'm educated better than I was when I was a teenager. So when I watched The Outcast when I was younger, I thought it was this fantastic episode addressing like the idea of a genderless society, the sort of how people feel when different than compared to what they're supposed to be in society. But watching it now and knowing it's in the context of the 24th century, I struggle with some of it. So some of the scenes where Riker is talking to Soren and he's talking about like, what should I call you? I can't call you it. And actually at work now, and in a lot of workplaces, but specifically my workplace, which is in higher education, so it's like a public institution, we have been trained on how to use gender neutral pronouns. So when I was watching that episode now, I sort of felt, you mean they don't know how to use gender neutral pronouns in the 24th century? Like, what? And I wonder a little bit if it's hard to look back on Star Trek that was made in the past and judge it with the awareness that we have now and the understanding of the society as we have now.
I think it's interesting that you were saying now you're more familiar with the LGBT community. I mean, and I know that, there are other letters that we could add to that list, but I mean, I think part of it is there was no LGBT community in those days. I mean, that's quite a recent thing. When I was going to university, for example, there would have been an LGB society. There wasn't any mention of T, the idea of kind of, I mean, and that's not to say that people weren't aware of the idea that some people might be trans, but it wasn't, there wasn't that kind of movement. We were that step behind in a sense. So I think that, these 90s Star Trek episodes, yes, they were sort of trying to address, sort of gay representation in one way or another. I mean, interestingly, in some of those issues, we look back at them now and we might see them more as kind of as trans issues. And a lot of them are sort of about gender. And this whole thing about pronouns, I mean, the issue about pronouns comes up almost every time Star Trek tries to deal with this issue. So there are all these difficulties with pronouns in The Outcast. There are difficulties with pronouns in Rejoined. I mean, the pronouns, and it's quite interesting. There's that quite nice scene between the two of them where they keep correcting themselves. She keeps saying, you did this and it made me nervous. And then she says, no, when he did this, it made her nervous. And it's like the fact that the pronouns are confused are sort of symbolic of the fact that their emotions are confused in a sense. And then we have this thing in Cogenitor and Enterprise even where, they have this, non-gendered being and they sort of start off calling it. And then there's an interesting thing that happens. I mean, first of all, of course, Trip, what always happens where, there's a male character who gets to know one of these androgynous characters is they basically, which is always played by a woman, is that they assume that they're female and they start calling them she rather than it at a certain point. It's interesting in that Enterprise episode, it's actually Dr. Phlox, I think, who first calls the Cogenitor she. And it comes exactly at the point where they've done this brain scan. They've discovered that the Cogenitor is not just a sort of dumb animal in a sense, but is mentally as capable as, is a kind of sentient species as any of them. And he's worked this out from the brain scan. And then suddenly he starts shifting into using this word she, which we've been told is not appropriate and is not the right word for these beings. It's interesting that there seems to be this sort of inability to, Clara, like you're saying, you might have to be trained in the idea of using gender neutral pronouns. And, I know some people, they don't refer to themselves as he or she, they refer to themselves as they. But Star Trek seems to have a real problem with this. And I don't know if you're familiar with those books, New Frontier books, but there was a character in those books, and this was back in the 90s, who was a hermaphrodite and had a whole different set of words. So it was like, instead of his or her, it was hish. And instead of he or she, I think it was like s/he. So the whole, every paragraph written about that character had to incorporate all these unfamiliar pronouns in order to constantly emphasize that was what this being was. It couldn't be reduced to either a he or a she.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that it when you first come to the idea of the fact that there are people who don't want to use he or she and they prefer to use a different pronoun, there are a whole bunch of other ones that people use, but I think they is quite a common one. It's tricky because you're not used to it, and your brain has to really try and condition itself to get used to using different pronouns. You don't realize until you're put to that challenge how often you use pronouns and you're just used to it being one or the other. It's very tricky and it does take a while, but it's something that just with practice you get there, sort of thing. But like you say, it is odd that in the 24th century, when we have a whole plethora of different species, races, all different genders, all different sort of planets, etc., that they haven't gotten over that yet. You'd think that they would have encountered that issue on numerous previous occasions. And also the fact that hopefully when we get to the 24th century for humans, ignoring every other race or species we might meet, just for humans, hopefully everybody's gotten much cooler with the idea of using all sorts of different pronouns by then, because it's just whatever people prefer to be called by.
So we've kind of touched upon like trans issues, not a huge amount, but a little bit. And we have also touched on gender. What I wanted to ask you guys about was about different kinds of sexual relationships. So I know that some characters, Like, for instance, I know that Phlox isn't necessarily shown as being bisexual, but he's in a polyamorous relationship. So technically his wife has lots of husbands, and I don't think he has more than one wife. Does he? I don't think.
Yeah, I think he does.
He has 3, doesn't he?
Oh, okay.
I think...
Yeah.
3 or 4? Yeah. He's definitely got a few.
And although that scene is kind of strange by Trip, it is expressed in the show, in Enterprise, as being something that's completely natural for the Denobulians. So it's something that is, I assume, accepted in the 24th century. But then there's also, like, Garak is an example as well. I know that Andrew Robinson originally portrayed Garak as... Pansexual, yeah.
He's like, I mean, I've seen him described as the sort of gay uncle character, basically. I think there is that kind of element. His relationship with Bashir is quite... I always found it surprising when he hooked up with Zial later on, because it did seem like he was not necessarily explicitly a gay character, but that was kind of...
He put out that impression,
sort of understood. Yeah, he definitely gave that impression.
But maybe he's bisexual, so...
But then Robinson has been quoted as saying that there was, like, a resistance to that. So afterwards, he then, went into this storyline where he falls in love with, or has a sort of a relationship with a young woman. And I wonder, where is that resistance coming from? Because the question I have is, like, it seems like throughout Star Trek history, throughout the history of the franchise, there has been fans lobbying for gay characters, and not just gay characters, different types of sexual relationships in the series. And that there is obviously a lot of fan fiction online that's written by fans that includes, they call it slash fan fiction, which includes a lot of different pairings amongst different genders and different kinds of sexual relationships. So where is that resistance coming from? Is it that the producers think that the only people that were watching it at the time, their target audience was a bunch of straight men in middle America? Or is it generally that people weren't watching on American TV at that time, like gay characters on television?
Well, I think it's varied over time. Maybe it would be helpful for us to sort of go, right back to the beginning at this stage and try and sort of track this issue as it's kind of reared its head through various iterations of Star Trek. Because I think it is something that has kind of popped up and then, maybe not always satisfactorily, but we can kind of trace how we've got from there to here, so to speak. Apparently, I saw an interview with George Takei where he said he actually had a conversation with Gene Roddenberry about it while the original series was on the air. And he said, he wasn't out at the time, so it was all a bit of a guarded conversation, but he basically said, I know you're committed to civil rights and kind of anti-racism and so on. What's your sort of feeling about gay rights and whether that's something that Star Trek could tackle? And Roddenberry basically apparently said to him then, yeah, I would like to do that, but they're looking for any excuse to cancel this show. I'm going to have to be a bit more cautious by this stage because it was kind of getting towards the end of all that. And I mean, I know later on in his life, Roddenberry, would often say at conventions and so on, oh yes, we're going to have a gay character. We're going to bring gay characters onto the Enterprise. And the emphasis seemed then to be pretty much what we've got with Discovery. It's going to be normal. It's going to be just kind of every day. It's not going to be some big thing. It's not going to be some big allegory or whatever. It's just, sort of recognizing that that's a normal part of culture of society. And he said some quite interesting things himself, I think. If you look at the book, The Last Conversation, which was an interview with Roddenberry shortly before he died, this is what he said about his own sexuality. He said, I'm sorry that I've never had a homosexual relationship. There must be many joys and pleasures and degrees of closeness in those relationships. So he was sort of almost saying that, if he'd been born in a later period, that might be something that would have been a part of his own experience. And obviously we know Roddenberry as, this kind of womanizing character. It's kind of interesting that he'd kind of come to that point. I mean, I think he also talked at other times about having kind of gone along with a degree of kind of homophobic, sort of joshing and sort of banter and that kind of thing when he was younger that he later came to feel badly about. But his idea was definitely, I think, to kind of just basically put some gay characters on the ship, whether in the background or whether in the foreground or whatever, and just sort of bring that into the Star Trek universe. But then, fortunately, he died before that ever happened. And I think ever since, we've had that kind of legacy of there being kind of resistance to doing that. And maybe there not having been that kind of figurehead around still to sort of push that forward somehow.
Yeah, I think you might be right there. It's interesting what you said that he actually said there, because I didn't know that, so I might have to check that book out. But yeah, it's interesting that that's something that he felt at the end of his life, that it was something he wished that he'd explored. So it kind of informs you a bit more about him as a person and kind of his thoughts about creating a show that challenged thinking, and even though he didn't go in that particular direction, he challenged a lot of other perceptions. So that's interesting. That's an interesting thing about him. But I don't know why it is that more than any of the other issues that we see on Star Trek, it's kind of the one that they just didn't really go for. I don't know whether it's just because, like, rights for people of different races, for example, you can't say to somebody, oh, you know, you can't be of that race, because that is just blatantly what they are, because you can see it. So therefore, the progression for that is not that it's any easier. I'm not saying it's easier, because I know there's a lot of hard fought stuff there, just as there is in all sorts of issues, but it's more visible. So you can't deny that that's what the person is, because you can see it. And the same with women's rights as well. You know, you can see that that person is a woman, you know, that it's not something that you can try and pretend isn't there. And I think with sort of LGBT community, for a lot of years, and we're still there in some ways, but, you know, we're getting over it now. Certainly in the UK, we're getting over it. But I mean, other parts of the world are having a lot more issues still. But it's people even trying to deny that it exists. You know, oh, you're talking nonsense. This isn't what you are. You're making this up. It's an abomination, and we'll cure you and we'll fix you and all the rest of it. And I think because of the fact that it's that, and the fact that if they were to bring on a black character, or they would bring a woman into a position of command, people couldn't push back against that, saying, well, that person doesn't exist. That thing isn't a thing. Why are you showing this to me? That's an abomination, because those people blatantly exist. And I think it's because it's something that you can't see, and because the interpretation of some people in certain religious areas is that this isn't something that is acceptable, that is one of the reasons why I think it's been so kind of pushed to the back burner. And it's like, well, we just, as much as we have been a pioneer of social progress and showing things before we get there was just some cold feet, I think, about doing that. And fear, I think, of being the first ones to do that, because of the reprisal, or the fear of the reprisal that might come from that.
It's like that sort of invisibility is almost possible, and I think it's kind of interesting, you know, and therefore you can have this situation where you have a character like Garak, who, you know, in some ways maybe is kind of coded as a gay character, even if no one's ever going to openly acknowledge that on screen. Do you know what I mean? So you have this kind of sense of these sort of hidden, this sort of subtext. So there might be a kind of gay subtext almost. And I think it's interesting, you know, Clara was talking about slash writers, you know, and slash writers go back to that period where the original series went off the air, and before the motion picture, that kind of period where it was in syndication, it was in reruns and so on, and where Star Trek really became a big thing. And that was very much an attempt to, it's a kind of resistant reading in a sense, to read something into Star Trek that wasn't really there, you know, and say, oh, yes, secretly Kirk and Spock were having this sexual relationship, and that's the thing that we kind of want to focus on. It's this sort of fantasy of a version of Star Trek that never quite existed. But on the other hand, then you do see it kind of feed in later on, to the point where by the time you get to Star Trek V, they have that moment not in front of the Klingons, which is kind of almost an acknowledgement of this sort of interpretation that's out there, that they've got this kind of relationship. I mean, it's kind of like an in-joke, but it's sort of almost incorporating that into the story on some level, or at least kind of nodding and winking to it. And I think it's interesting in terms of, you know, I think when you had those slash fans, and there were a lot of them, you know, producing this work, producing these zines, putting a lot of effort into these stories and illustrations and everything. And then you had obviously other fans who probably thought they were mad, and, you know, and didn't really appreciate it, and didn't like this kind of approach that they were taking, because they were very much trying to sort of, you know, shape Star Trek into something they wasn't in some ways with those characters. They weren't just adding a gay character who would fit in that way that we're talking about. They were actually saying, look, you know, yeah, you might not have seen it on screen, but this is what was really going on, and kind of trying to reinterpret it like that. But, you know, they were a very big movement, and they had a big impact on, you know, not just Star Trek fandom, but fandom generally. And I think a lot of fan fiction, as we understand it these days on the internet and so on, owes its kind of origin to those zines, and to those, and particularly to these, you know, frankly pornographic stories. You know, they're not just romance stories, they're quite sort of hard pornography, basically, that these generally straight middle-aged women were writing all over America. So it's a kind of, you know, it's a bizarre cultural phenomenon that came about off the back of Star Trek, even if it's not sort of part of the official, you know, canonical Star Trek story, that it's kind of, you know, it's this very strange, interesting phenomenon that's kind of tagged on the side of it.
So I think one of the reasons why slash fan fiction is something that is really big, and it's not just big in Star Trek, it's big in a lot of fandoms, is because we live in a very sexualized society. And so whenever and romantic love is very much linked to sexual love, but there's also, I guess, so we use The Host as an example of this. This is a strange episode for me, The Host, where Beverly Crusher falls in love with a Trill, whose host changes multiple times, and by the end of it, she just can't be with the ambassador, his imperial ambassador. She can't be with him at the end because he's changed bodies so many times. And I think you're supposed to think that the fact that he's changed bodies so many times is kind of what disturbs her more than the fact that he's actually in a female body by the end of it. Mm-hmm. But when I watched that episode, one of the things that really struck me as disturbing more than the idea of it being a female body is that she actually was okay with it essentially having a sort of sexual relationship with her Trill lover in Riker's body.
Yeah. And
so in my mind, love is a very complicated thing. And it's not, for me, it's not so much the idea that the gender is the same or the gender is different. I think if I was Crusher, I think I wouldn't have such a problem with the female body, the Trill being in the female body. I'd have more of a problem with the fact that I was having a sexual experience with somebody that was like my co-worker, who I was, who one of my close friends had a relationship with, who I essentially saw as somebody who I was friends with, rather than it being the same gender as me. And so that's one of the things I think is interesting about about slash fan fiction, is that people are trying to make a very close romantic love into something sexual. And I think that's because we live in a very sexualized society. And I do think that the relationship between Kirk and Spock is more than just brothers. It's more than just friends. I mean, they spend their entire lives together practically. All the adventures they have together, the things that they sacrifice for each other. And I've seen this again and again in TV series and films throughout my entire life that I've watched, are these very close relationships between men, these very close relationships between women that are more than just friendships. They are like romantic love. And when I think about like my best friend, who's a woman, I don't want to be in a sexual relationship with her, but I definitely feel more for her than I would feel for a sister. I feel more for her than I feel for a friend. There is like a soulmate aspect to it. Like we are very, very close. And I think what happens is with slash fan fiction is that people look at that romantic relationship and they don't differentiate between what's a romantic love and what's a sexual love. And so they have to put a sexual element into it. I'm not denying that some of slash fan fiction is turning the sort of heterosexual like norm of Star Trek on its head and trying to add like a gay element, which I definitely am not against. But I've seen a lot of TV series where there's been two men who have basically been in love with each other and could have a sexual relationship, but because the producers are too frightened of alienating an audience, and it is primarily straight men that they're worried about alienating, they will say, these men are like brothers, that they're friends with each other, and the two men are looking at each other like they're in love with each other, but there can't be any sex. There can't be any sex. And the idea that people can't differentiate between what's romantic love and what's sexual love just like astounds me. So I do think that Kirk and Spock are in love. They're just not sexually involved with each other. Does that make sense? They're not sexually involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah. And we get that, of course, in Deep Space Nine. Again, I mean, the other kind of, Bashir is basically involved in both these kind of subtextual relationships in a way. But again, there's this kind of teasing, with that scene where O'Brien basically admits he'd rather spend time with Bashir than with his wife. Yeah. And, they're always they're quite uncomfortable about it because they're both obviously these heterosexual guys, and they're sort of, they're aware that their relationship is unusually close in a way, at least for the two of them. It seems maybe a closer relationship than they were expecting to have, somehow more meaningful. And I think it's very much in that kind of Kirk and Spock model. I mean, it's true. You're right. So it's not that it comes from nowhere, but it is at the same time. Clara, I don't know if did you have a look at that book NASA Trek that I sent you?
Yeah, I'm going to just admit right now, I don't know how she managed to link sex, NASA, and Star Trek all together. I was like, what?
With a slash. That's the thing. You can do anything with a slash. Well, this is a book by Constance Penley, which is about. We were looking at it because we're doing a forthcoming episode. Yeah, this is sort of what I was gearing towards. We're doing a forthcoming episode on NASA and Star Trek, and so I was sort of looking at it in terms of that, and I had a spare copy, so I sent it to Clara. But actually, I was thinking in terms of this. There's a big part of that book which is all about the slash phenomenon, which is why it's called NASA slash. NASA Trek. The idea of NASA and Star Trek have this weird slash relationship. And it's quite striking because I sent it to you and you were saying, you're having a chance to read it. And I said, be careful if you read it at work, because some of the pictures in this book are quite shocking, or at least explicit. I mean, just for Kay's benefit, not for the benefit of the listeners, but I mean, so they range from like, I'm just going to hold up this book to the picture. So these are the kind of more romantic things that I suppose Clara was talking about. So this is Kirk and Spock, sort
having
of
a snuggle,
hugging, and it's all quite sweet. Exactly. And you've got this one where they're sharing a nice glass of champagne. But then if you turn the page, you end up here.
Oh, right, okay. That's out there.
It's somewhere that you don't really expect.
I opened that page up on the tube. I'm just going to say, I was very, very crowded tube train, and I was like,
okay, let's not look at that then.
I don't think we can even really describe what's happening in this picture without affecting our
nudity. There's nudity,
our rating. But it's a fairly explicit and sort of sexy image basically of the two of them, and I suppose it's interesting. I don't know, I was just thinking, Clara, you were saying about other fandoms and so on having this kind of slash phenomenon, and I don't know whether, I know you're very into the X-Files. I don't know what the fan fiction is like for the X-Files, but I know that, say, watching on screen, one of the things that's interesting about that relationship between Mulder and Scully on screen is there's a lot of kind of teasing, a lot of kind of subtext, and a lot of like, is there must be more going on than maybe what we're seeing on screen, but we're really not being shown very much of it. It's a kind of resistance to showing the audience very much. And obviously, these days we have different kind of expectations with TV and sexuality and how much we're going to get shown, and how kind of it's not as coy as it used to be, where you can represent sex by Captain Kirk putting his boots on the next morning or whatever. You can actually have, if you think of something like Game of Thrones or a lot of modern TV, you do get kind of sex on screen. But I mean, it's interesting when it comes to LGBT relationships and same sex on screen, that I think still is quite a taboo area in some ways in terms of the culture. I mean, I know, for example, when the film Brokeback Mountain came out, that was a kind of maybe a bit of a turning point. That was quite controversial to a lot of people. I mean, thinking about, say, we were talking about these gay characters on TV in the 90s, around the time that we're thinking Star Trek was kind of failing in this issue. We had we had things like Will and Grace, we had things like Ellen, we had these quite safe, not particularly sexy kind of representations of same-sex relationships. But then you got something like Queer as Folk towards the end of the 90s, and that was really quite shocking, I think, because it was very sexual. It was very kind of, I was going to say graphic. I don't know if it's graphic exactly, but it is in a sense. It's like, it probably shocked people at the time more than some of these kind of safer, tamer kind of representations.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it was graphic in the sense that, you see it a lot, but in terms of the representation of what is obviously going on and how sort of the forcefulness of it, it's not airbrushed, it's very real, it's very in your face, it's very immediate in that way, and it's not in the way that a lot of soft sex scenes are on TV, airbrushed and kind of gentle and quiet and not at all realistic. It's quite realistic, it's quite immediate in that sense, so you really do
rather
get
than romantic.
Do
you know what I mean? It's like it's about desire, it's about the sort of passion and so on, rather than about the kind of romance and the relationship and so on.
Well, you could say the same for like Orange is the New Black. Like the sex scenes in Orange. I mean, I know it hasn't caused as much of a controversy as Queer as Folk, but because we've moved on, like in terms of like what people deem as acceptable on television. But Orange is the New Black has got some quite graphic sex scenes, but none of them, I would say, are. Like, I don't think any of it's in bad taste. You know what I mean? Like, for me, bad taste sex scenes are stuff that are just laughably ridiculous. Like, I'm not going to lie, like 50 Shades of Grey. Or, or very violent, unless they're making some sort of point about sexual violence. So I think in Orange is the New Black, they just seemed like very natural. And I think that's kind of the thing that I think maybe Queer as Folk was trying to do as well. And
there is romance in Orange is the New Black as well.
Oh,
because you do get like I was going to do a spoiler. I don't even want to spoil it. Anyway, there was certainly at least one very romantic couple in Orange is the New Black, which was shown in a much more kind of romantic mold, I suppose, than that. But yeah, I think you're right, Clara. There's definitely this kind of sense of realism about it, I suppose. And also the fact that in that program there is a kind of sense that, and I don't really know how this plays into kind of the sort of political issues around LGBT representation, but there is this fact that a lot of these are, they're women in a prison, they're in there for a long time. There's this sense that a lot of them are having gay relationships that they wouldn't have had in the outside world. There is a kind of situational element to it there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing as well that we can relate to this is the fact that around the same time as Queer as Folk was happening in the UK, we had our own women's prison drama called Bad Girls. And that showed a lot of lesbian relationships and, you know, women encountering women having relationships with other women for the first time and how they reacted to that, and the fact that they were maybe looking to other women for comfort because they were away from their families and all the rest of it. So there was an awful lot going on there, and that's really like it's a very similar melting pot to Orange is the New Black, even though it's done with more of a British spin than with an American spin. So there's differences there, but you know, there's a lot of parallels, and that came out the same year as Queer as Folk, which was 1999. So
I actually remember there being an interview on, I think it was on Newsnight with the Queer as Folk, and I remember it caused such a controversy that the people were interviewing this guy on the news, asking him, like, is this a fair representation of the gay community? Is this something you want to present? Because obviously there was drug taking in the series and there was casual sex, and his response was, well, actually, straight people take drugs and straight people have casual sex too. It's just the only reason you're objecting to it in this series is because there's also gay sex in it. And it's the gay sex that's shocking you, and you're choosing to take issue with that. And I thought that was quite an interesting point for him to make, that actually in lots of TV series or films where there's a heterosexual story, we actually also see like bad things, but no one really takes issue with it because it's heterosexual sex. So, and that's kind of what people were comfortable with seeing on screen. And some of the explicit scenes, there are explicit scenes in Star Trek. If you think about T'Pol, like, disrobing, I'm not explicit, but she's definitely naked, you know? And so we're going to get a naked, like, female Vulcan, but, like, God forbid there should be two men kiss. Do you know what I mean? Like, two men kissing is it's like horrifying, but a naked Vulcan who's going to have casual sex with her co-worker. And what if Trip didn't want it? You know, I mean, she's coming on to it. He wanted it, you know he did.
They want that man. Do you remember on the old, like, you used to, whenever you got a video out, for, you know, they used to have that man who would stand up and he'd say, this video has been rated 15. It may contain strong language and some sexy scenes. That was always the expression that he used.
Some sexy scenes.
It's
oh,
like
very brief nudity. Oh gosh, I remember that.
There might not be nudity, but you get the odd sexy scenes. And I suppose there's also this element with, you know, with these kind of subtextual gay characters, someone like Garak, that does sort of play into a kind of a cultural idea of like the you know, the eternal bachelor, the character who's sort of coded as gay but is also sexless in a sense. So you don't really expect him to ever have a sexual relationship. You expect him to kind of, because he is, you know, different sexually to other people, he kind of is almost step back from it somehow. And I think with Garak, that's why you get this idea of Garak as the, you know, the gay uncle or whatever. He's kind of, you don't expect him to get involved in, which is maybe another reason why it's surprising when he gets together with Zial, because you don't really expect him to get involved in a relationship with anyone, because he seems like that sort of confirmed bachelor kind of character somehow. He seems to play into that sort of stereotype.
Absolutely. And I was really, really surprised actually when he had that relationship with Zial. I don't feel like it, I mean, I know that they have a close relationship prior to that, but I never saw it that way. I saw it as a very different type of relationship. So I'm not sure whether that ever really worked for me, but yeah, that was quite surprising. And like you say, you know, you can read a lot into Garak's character and the way that he's presented and how he is. Maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, because we're probably being very stereotypical by saying that, you know, but the signs potentially are there. But then you sort of get into this difficulty of how do you show that a character is gay or bisexual without them being in a relationship, and how do you, or having them actually explicitly say it or tell somebody. How do you do that? Like you can't really, because the majority of people will read a character straight until they're told otherwise. So you can't really, unless you put them into a relationship or you have them talk about it, you can't really easily show it. So that's a tricky one.
This was sort of the issue with Sulu in Beyond as well, wasn't it? There was this kind of, you know, there was sort of a backlash to the idea of Sulu being gay in Beyond, or, you know, having this gay relationship. And, you know, and even George Takei was sort of saying, well, you know, I think it's great for Star Trek to have a gay character, but Sulu's not gay, as far as I'm concerned. And then other people were sort of saying, well, how do you know? Because, you know, just because we've never seen him, I mean, I can't even remember if we ever saw him in a straight relationship. You know, there was just an absence of information. Even if we had, he might be bisexual. Do you know what I mean? You can't really, in a way, you can't make that assumption. I think it's interesting what that comment that Gene Roddenberry was making about wishing that he'd had a gay relationship. He also said his sort of belief was that in essence, everyone was kind of bisexual or potentially bisexual, and it was to do with their upbringing and their culture and all these things. You know, that again, it might be a controversial view in some ways, but I wonder if that's also one of the things that Beverly Crusher is sort of hinting at towards the end of The Host, because she says, I think it's difficult. It puts her in this awkward position because, as Clara pointed out, she's happy to get together with Riker when Riker is carrying the guy that she's in love with. When it turns out to be a woman, she's just like, sorry, I can't do that. And it's kind of like, and on one level, you sort of feel disappointed by her. And she does say, you know, maybe at one point in the future, these things won't be, you know, this will be more open to other possibilities or whatever. And she also, it's a very confusing scene because she also tries to kind of slightly deflect it by implying that it's not about the fact that it's a woman, and it's the fact that, you know, she says, I just can't keep up. You know, you keep changing all these times. You know, how am I going to know who you're going to be next? And that's not really that convincing. But at the same time, is there, I mean, leaving aside the fact that Riker is her friend and so on, if we assume that as far as we know, Beverly is heterosexual, are we expecting her to be happy to have a, you know, relationship with another woman, or to be able to do that? And is that really fair to expect that in order to kind of conform to this kind of egalitarian utopian ideal? Is that sort of almost going too far?
Yeah.
And it raises this interesting question. You were talking about Orange is the New Black. One of the interesting characters in Orange is the New Black is, you know, the trans character. And when you go into the backstory of that character, you know, she was previously a he who was a fireman, and we see the relationship that he had with his wife at that time. And then obviously, you know, so she was in the situation of being married to someone who decides that, you know, really he's a woman and needs to go through that transition and so on. And what do you do in that situation? Because that is the closest real world situation to some of these Star Trek stories that you get, like in Rejoined, or you get in, you know, in The Host, of actually being in a relationship with someone, being married to someone, and then their gender potentially changing, and whether that, you know, is your relationship able to kind of transcend that or not? And I think that's quite a complicated question that there isn't necessarily an easy answer to.
No.
I mean, so in some ways I feel a bit sorry for Beverly in that episode, because I feel like she's sort of representing a kind of failure, and she's taking kind of Star Trek's failure on some level. Yeah. And maybe, like, from a kind of character point of view, we should cut her a bit of slack there, you know, that she didn't feel able to do that.
Absolutely. And I think I have heard people say about that episode, oh, you know, isn't it homophobic of her that she won't date the woman? And I'm like, no, because basically that's like saying it's homophobic to be straight, which of course it isn't, because that's just how you are attracted to people sexually. You know, you're attracted to the opposite sex, and that is absolutely fine. Just like it's absolutely fine to be attracted to the same sex, or a mixture of both, or, you know, any sex, because obviously we recognise more than two genders these days, you know, and any of those. So I think it's definitely almost pushed on us that is a bit homophobic of her, that, oh, look, because it's a woman now she doesn't want to date her, isn't that bad of her, and maybe one day she'll get over that. Well, imagine if you flipped the coin and said, oh, well, now the gay character won't date the you know, the gay woman won't date the man. Isn't that awful? One day maybe we'll get her to do that. And it's like, that's not okay. So why is it okay to say it the other way? No, it's not okay at all. Yeah. It's absolutely not okay to say that. So yeah, I have massive issues with anybody that suggests that is a thing at all.
Yeah, and with Crusher, it's like you say, for me, I'm watching that episode, I still think it's weird that she would, like, be okay with sleeping with Riker. But,
yes.
But you're right, she's presented as heterosexual, so she isn't going to want to sleep with a woman, which is fine. In terms of another character that I thought was quite interesting is Kira. So Kira in the Mirror Universe, and I have a problem with women in DS9 in the Mirror Universe all being presented as bisexual or as lesbians, because the Mirror Universe is a morally corrupt universe. And so, you know, their morally corrupt behavior is to be homosexual. That's suggesting that homosexuality is something that's bad. So
Yeah.
I have a real big problem with that.
It's also with the intendant. It's very closely associated with her narcissism because you know in the first time we meet the intendant, she's sexually interested in Kira, and you know, and she even has this line. She says, "Well, if you can't love me, who can?" And there's this real sense that you know because we know first of all she's a narcissist. She's obsessed with herself, you know, and so she's interested in Kira because there's this kind of sexual thrill of having sex with herself almost.
Yeah.
And it's only sort of after that we then see her in relationships with other women, and so I think there's this kind of weird, you know, quite outdated idea that homosexuality is a kind of narcissistic behavior somehow rather than and
there's a deviance to it as well. Like that's how I think I agree with you, Clara. I feel like as much as there are a lot of elements of sexuality in the Mirror Universe that I love because I like to see them being more open about that stuff in Star Trek than we've seen previously, I agree that there's this deviancy almost that's presented with it that I do have a problem with. But I choose to just... This is my own personal headcanon that we're going into now, but I choose to believe that Kira in the normal universe is bisexual, but she's just never had chance to explore that because she's been too busy running away from Cardassians and hitting Cardassians. So that is my, you know, because I'm like, well, why would somebody's sexuality be different just because they're in the Mirror Universe? You're still the same person. You're just a product of like the upbringing that you've had there, which might make you not as nice a person potentially, but...
So I totally agree with that. I agree that I in my mind, Kira is genuinely much more fluid with her sexuality. And the reason why I think that is because she engages in a relationship with Odo. And let's be honest, Odo, I mean, there's no indication that Odo actually has a gender. He chooses to be male. And I know we see a female shapeshifter, but we're never shown like how the shapeshifters or the changelings actually procreate. He melds or he blends with the shapeshifter, the changeling Lal. Is it Lal? I think it is Lal, who's the male changeling that he meets later in the DS9 series. And they have this.
Oh yeah. What is his name?
Lal?
No, Lal is Data's daughter. What is the guy
Data's
called?
daughter.
I was going to say Lars or something. It's not that.
I don't remember, but yes, I know the one you mean.
The guy who's played by General Martok.
Yeah. So he has
the changeling.
And actually, that's a good episode to talk about LGBT because there is that line in it that Quark says, you know, now is not the time for a changeling pride parade on the habitat ring or whatever it is, the promenade. So that is an example of two characters who are trying to be ethnically, like, intrinsically themselves, and they can't be because of discrimination. But there's no indication that Odo is actually got a gender, and he's also a fluid being. He's a fluid creature that can become anything. You know, so like essentially, like Kira is having a sexual. I assume it's sexual. It must be Kira having a sexual relationship with an alien or creature that doesn't have a gender and can also become a mouse if he wants to, or a bird, or he could become a woman or become a man. I mean, so I have to think Kira has to be open-minded at least a little bit.
Yeah.
In order
absolutely.
To be like that. So
yeah, and I think just like everything else in DS9, you know, everything is shades of grey in Deep Space Nine. Absolutely everything is shades of grey. So why shouldn't sexuality be shades of grey as well? You know, why shouldn't we see a spectrum rather than seeing poles or seeing discrete sort of descriptions of sexuality? Why shouldn't it be, well, actually, I'm just going to see who comes along, and if we click, then cool. And that's kind of the attitude that seems to pervade it for me, anyway, and fits with the whole ethos of DS9 as a show.
Certainly with DS9, I mean, with Kira, you get. I thought, Clara, what you were going to say when you were saying this is what makes me think she's bisexual is that she has that remark in Rejoined, which is quite interesting at the beginning, where she basically says, "So what's the problem?" You know, her reaction to the fact that, which I think is a progressive moment in itself, in a way, for Star Trek. So there's these two women who, you know, there's this kind of issue: are they going to get together or whatever? And lots of people have issues with it. And I know that there's this kind of allegorical sidestepping where it's not about the fact that they're two women that everyone's having issues with it. It's about this other thing. But at the same time, the fact that Kira, who is actually quite a conservative character, do you know what I mean? She's quite religious. She's got this, you know, compared to kind of Starfleet standards, she's not a kind of enlightened utopian person exactly. She in some ways is a more conservative character. But on this issue, she's just like, I don't get it. What's the problem? Why shouldn't they get together if they want to? Why does anyone care? And Dr. Bashir says, oh, but they think it's unnatural. And she's just like, well, that's ridiculous. So she has this quite instinctive idea that kind of prejudice is just absurd, really. It doesn't really make sense to her. And I think that's quite interesting because, a lot of these episodes, they are partly looking at, even like stigma as well. They're looking at kind of bigotry, and they're looking at prejudice, and they're looking at where they get their kind of emotional drama is from the kind of the behavior of those who want to control these people and want to stop these relationships. So even in, say, the Outcast, that kind of tribunal that is, punishing her and punishing, I shouldn't say her. See, I've fallen into the pronoun problem. Is punishing the character, Soren, and imposing kind of censure on them. And these are the kind of emotional heart of those episodes in some ways. And I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the questions that we kind of started off with was, what are the obstacles to Star Trek having, had gay characters before? What is it that's made this such a sticky issue? And there is, I think, repeatedly, there have been people who have been blocking it, whether that's producers, whether that's, network people, whoever it is. I mean, going right back to early Next Generation, David Gerrold, who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles, tried to write an episode of The Next Generation which would have 2 gay characters in it. And basically it blew up in such a big sort of nasty row that I think that was one of the main reasons he ended up leaving Next Generation. And the way he tells it in that instance, it was largely, I think, this guy Leonard Maislish, who was Gene Roddenberry's lawyer, who was had his finger in the pies of the Next Generation at that time, and was exercising a lot of control, even though he wasn't really a creative person, and was, by all accounts, pretty awful, bigoted, nasty, very like almost sort of anti-Roddenberry. He was the kind of, what's that guy in The Lord of the Rings who's advising the nice king and telling him to do awful things and so on. He was like this awful kind of advisor, the devil on Roddenberry's shoulder almost. And the way Gerald tells it, he was quite abusive to him. He said, I've got a quote here, and I'm not going to read it because I literally can't read it, I don't think, or we won't be able to put this episode out. But, he called him some really appalling names, as well as saying that he thought he was AIDS infested, as he described it, because this episode was dealing with the kind of HIV issue. And it's sort of interesting, finally when we get to Enterprise, they do this kind of AIDS episode, but they're it's like 15 years later or something by then, and it's not Star Trek doing something socially progressive, which it would have been if they'd made David Gerrold's episode, which in the end he only managed to make as a fan, one of the fan series, that they actually made this episode and made it a fan original series episode. And it's kind of interesting, so again, you've got the Slash people writing this kind of fiction that's not official. You've got, even David Gerrold, a respected Star Trek writer, having to turn his story into a kind of piece of fan fiction in a sense in order to get it out there. You've got Jerry Taylor on Voyager, who said she was always committed to trying to get gay representation on Voyager, but she said, basically, in the end I gave up. It was a battle I couldn't win because there were too many people blocking me. And Kate Mulgrew said the same thing about Rick Berman. She said, I would go to Rick Berman, I say it again and again and again, and why aren't we having a gay character? And he would just say, oh, it's not the time, just be patient, it's not the time right now. Really kind of sort of blocking this. And her response was then, she wrote these Voyager novels. She managed to find a way of putting it into her novels. So in the novel Pathways, you get, again, this quite sort of matter-of-fact mention of these two male characters who've recently got into a relationship. And it's completely kind of, exactly what we're talking about, the brushing the teeth or whatever. It's not really a big thing. It's a kind of a normalized thing. And you also get this maybe more interesting story about Harry Kim, where when Harry Kim was at the academy, his roommate fell in love with him. Basically, his male roommate fell in love with him and assumed that he was gay because he hadn't seen him, because he wasn't, out with women all the time or whatever, and kind of just guessed that he must be gay, which is kind of interesting because Harry Kim was one of those characters who I think there was this kind of potential around, could this be a gay character? And what you kept having in Star Trek around that time, because there was all this pressure to have a gay character, was having these characters where they're sort of thinking, well, can we make this the gay character? And obviously they didn't do that with Harry Kim. Then we saw it again with Malcolm Reed in Enterprise. There was a lot of expectation that he was going to be a gay character. And then, in fact, he wasn't. And even I think they sort of played on that. I mean, if you look at the very last episode of Enterprise, These Are the Voyages, there's a kind of, again, a kind of in-joke about the fact that Malcolm Reed might or might not have been gay, because there's that scene where Riker is interviewing the various Enterprise crew members, and the way it's edited, it cuts so that he asks a question to one person and another person answers it, because because he's interviewing lots of them, and he appears to ask Reed if he's attracted to Trip, and in fact he's asking Hoshi if she's attracted to Trip. But it's like, again, that kind of tease of like, yeah, we know that you sort of thought we were doing this, but guess what, we weren't.
Yeah, it's like they want to do it, but they're just not brave enough. So they're like, oh, we'll just hint at it and that'll do, which of course it won't, because hints isn't representation. So
I read a quote by Ronald D. Moore who said that actually he dreaded being asked, why are there not more gay characters in Star Trek, when he was working on Star Trek, because he actually said he could never think of a good reason for why there weren't more gay characters. And he said there is no good reason. And that's sort of suggesting that there was a level of homophobia, that at the level where people were making story decisions and people were making narrative decisions, and where people were, like you said, turning down scripts that may have included, characters who were gay in them. And it's not just about representation on screen of what's in our world. Star Trek itself is important because it's a means for public conversation about our society and our collective experience of our world. And one of the collective experiences of our world is the struggle of the LGBT community to achieve equality with everybody else. And that's something that we've seen, even just in recent years with like gay marriage being legalized in the US. So it's part of our society, part of our collective history of the Western world, and Star Trek should represent that. And so to deliberately maybe prevent gay characters being integrated into the narrative of the franchise is not just homophobic, it's kind of like wasting your chance to actually say something meaningful. And it's negligent if you're a Star Trek producer or a Star Trek writer, because if you wanted to work on a show where, you just want to make exciting TV, or you want to make exciting adventure stories every week, then you should go work on a different show, because Star Trek's never been about that. Star Trek's always been about talking about the human experience and about making parallel connections with our society and with our world.
And there's an interesting story actually in relation to that, I think, which kind of goes to sort of speak to that issue of the kind of the creative types who are on board with the kind of Star Trek message, and the producers and the executive types who maybe aren't, which is that in the making of the episode The Offspring, when Data has a daughter, creates a daughter, which also has interesting things to say about gender, because he lets the child choose its gender. But leaving that aside, there's this scene in there where apparently it was written in the script that Guinan was supposed to give this speech about sexuality, basically. And she essentially had this speech saying, well, when a man and a woman are interested in each other, then they do this and they do that or whatever. And apparently Whoopi Goldberg said, come on, guys, I'm not saying that. This is Star Trek. We can do better than that. Yeah. And insisted on changing the line so that it didn't say it was about a man and a woman. But then there was this kind of issue where, taking that a bit further, it was decided to have a same-sex couple holding hands in the background of one of the shots, just to kind of sort of emphasize that point that there might be same-sex couples around, which we do see in Discovery, actually, as well as Culber and Stamets. I think in that party scene, we see, some same-sex couples hooking up kind of in the background, and it's not really, it's not really remarkable. But apparently the producers got wind of this, and David Livingston, who was the kind of producing director at the time on TNG, came down to the, to the studio floor, basically from his office, and stopped them from doing it, and basically said, you're not doing that. You're not showing this same-sex relationship even in the background. So that was very much, literally a kind of producer interfering and blocking them from doing something like that. And I think when you talk about homophobia, I mean, particularly after Gene Roddenberry died, it has been largely straight men who've been running Star Trek. And, whether it's a kind of really vicious, nasty homophobia, whether it's just a kind of thoughtless, a bit like that kind of banter that we were talking about. Gene Roddenberry was saying that, he had this. I mean, I think Rick Berman is a big figure here. Kate Mulgrew sort of basically said, well, Rick Berman would always say no to this. David Gerrold said, there's an interview where he describes Berman as a raging homophobe. So that was his impression, was that it went further than that. He was actually actively opposed to this idea because he for his own reasons. Then you get someone like Brannon Braga, who I think is just looking at his kind of record on the issue. It's not necessarily that he's exactly homophobic, but he seems to be very insensitive, or certainly there, in those days. I don't know what he's like now, hopefully he's improved, but certainly he was very insensitive to these issues. So you can read online, there's an interesting discussion from a gay writer who came in to pitch to Voyager, and he said that Brannon Braga made him feel very uncomfortable during this pitch session, because every storyline that he pitched, he basically misinterpreted it as if the guy was pitching a gay storyline. So kind of playing into this idea of why is Star Trek not doing gay storylines? And the guy was saying he had one idea for a story with Harry Kim and this alien woman, and Braga was sort of deliberately misunderstanding him to think that he wanted Harry Kim to get together with a guy. And this guy was saying it was making him feel really uncomfortable, because he was like, he's not listening to my story ideas, he's just making jokes about the fact that I'm gay, basically. And then again, you sort of get the same thing with Enterprise, where if you look at the Blu-ray interviews for Enterprise, you know, you have these, I think there's an interview with Dominic Keating, who doesn't come out of this very well, I don't think, because there was this issue about whether Malcolm Reed might be gay or not. Basically, Dominic Keating said he had no idea about this until he saw a thing in a magazine or something saying, is this a gay character? And he was sort of horrified, basically. That was his idea. He's like, I didn't sign on to play a gay character. I don't want to play a gay character. And then he rang up Brannon Braga and said, you know, what's all this about the gay character? And Braga's response was to basically play a practical joke on him to wind him up, because he thought it was hilarious, the idea that he, you know, might have ended up playing this gay character. Say, oh yeah, you know, I've got all these interviews lined up with the gay press and everything, and we're going to do this, you know, big thing about it. Exactly what we see with Discovery now, where, you know, you get Wilson Cruz and Anthony Rapp doing these interviews with gay publications and so on, and doing that in a positive way. But, you know, for Braga, it seemed like that was just a kind of joke to wind up his straight friend into the idea of, you know, how people might think you're gay. And it's just kind of, it's not, whether you call that homophobia exactly or not, you know, it's not necessarily a vicious bigotry, but it's certainly a kind of insensitivity and a lack of inclusiveness and a lack of really taking that issue seriously. That is, you know, so that may be part of the answer. You know, if we're saying why has this been such a difficult issue for so long, it is partly people like that standing in the way and kind of, you know, refusing to take on board that this is an important issue. Yeah, definitely. It's like the locker room talk side of things, as you say, you know, haha, you know, he's gay, whatever, you know, it's not, it's all tied up with toxic masculinity, really, in the sense that, you know, in order to be a man, you have to be macho and you have to, you know, sleep with all these women and all the rest of it. You know, it's like if there's any hint that you might be gay, then there's a question over that. And, you know, men whose masculinity is very fragile can struggle with those sort of accusations. So I think it's all tied up with that sort of thing and the issues around gender and the way that we treat the sexes.
It's also this idea that if they're talking about appealing to a certain audience, it's also this idea that Hollywood still seems to have, which is that straight men aged between like 19 to 45, which is a big percentage of the film going audience or TV audience, won't watch stories about gay people, won't watch stories about people who are from different ethnic backgrounds, and won't watch stories about women. So, you know, we have to make a film that's going to appeal to these men, and so we're going to sell them short by basically sending them something or giving them something that is about white straight men, and we're not going to show the diversity of gender or of, you know, ethnic background or of sexuality, because we don't think these people can cope with it. And I have attended numerous, I mean, I live in a big city, multicultural city, so I live with I can imagine it'd be different in different areas of the world. I'm lucky in the sense that I have a community around me in where I live where it's just very diverse, and I work in an institution that's very diverse, so my experience is quite different. But I have attended numerous films over the last few years that I would say were about gay storylines or contained gay romances, and a good percentage of people in the audience weren't gay. You know, so this idea that only gay people are going to watch films about gay people, and only women are going to watch films about women. An example recently that in the last year was the idea that men wouldn't watch a film about a female superhero. You know, men wouldn't watch Wonder Woman because the main character is a woman. And countless men watched Wonder Woman. You know, and I don't think it was just because Gal Gadot is gorgeous. I mean, she is gorgeous, but they watched it also because, you know, it's a good storyline and she's a good actress and it's a fun film. And I think if you're female or if you're gay, you've been watching storylines about straight people and straight men for your entire life. So the idea that you have to do that, but that straight men wouldn't be able to cope with a storyline about a gay woman or a gay man, you know, is a bit ridiculous, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's also, I mean, maybe it's also that just people who make I mean, this is a generalization, but, you know, maybe it does partly come down to a difference between the kind of creative people and the more businessy people. And someone like Rick Berman, I mean, aside from, you know, his own personal views and, you know, whether he has any gay friends and what his kind of attitude is if one of his kids turns out to be gay or whatever, there's also like, I think he comes to Star Trek very much as a business person, as an executive, as someone, you know, making these things. And he has a background, I think, in kids' TV before that. He'd worked on some kids' TV programs. And kids' TV program is often surprisingly conservative. And you get these kind of attitudes of like, oh, boys won't watch a show about a female character. But, you know, and you get that thing, but girls will watch anything. And that's the kind of assumption. And therefore we might as well make everything about, you know, straight white males because, you know, then everyone will watch it. And it's not, you know, as you say, Clara, it's not really true, but it's also, it taps into this kind of conservative streak, which is not necessarily, I mean, it is socially conservative, but it's also partly about just not being willing to risk anything that might, you know, end up in you getting less money in the long run. And, you know, in a way, sadly, that's probably quite a big part of it. But it's interesting when you know, from the other perspective, I mean, you've got Whoopi Goldberg saying, I want this to go further. Contrast to Brannon Braga and, you know, and Dominic Keating, who is not obviously an executive or whatever, but had this quite strong reaction about not wanting to play a gay character. It's interesting, you know, there's this story about the filming of The Outcast that Jonathan Frakes has said many times since then that he thought that the character that he was in love with should have been played by a man, and it would have made the point more effectively. And, you know, there's no particular reason why these androgynous characters have to always be played by women, except that they're usually in storylines with male characters, and that therefore makes it somehow acceptable to the audience because it makes it less of a gay relationship somehow. And, you know, his view was that he obviously, you know, would have been happy playing Commander Riker in a relationship with a character that was played by a man. He didn't seem to have a problem with that. But, you know, for someone like Dominic Keating, that seems to be, you know, a really awful, embarrassing sort of thing that he might, you know, find himself in that kind of Brannon Braga prank, sort of almost tricked into playing this character that he didn't sign up.
I understand what you're saying. I think when you're talking about business, the difference between like maybe the people who are involved in the business of making the show, so making it sure that it gets enough audience figures, that it's making money, versus the people who are in the creative part of the show, who are the ones who are trying to write the storylines and come up with the characters. The problem with that is that Star Trek is more than just average television. I mean, I know I'm going to say that as a Trekkie fan. Everyone's like, yeah, of course you're going to say that. But Gene Roddenberry started out with a vision. He wanted to make television that broke barriers, was about social commentary, that got people to think, that widened people's minds. He didn't just want to make television that was financially successful. So, you know, if you want to make television that's financially successful and you think the best way to do that is to have some sort of heterosexual romance, then there's loads of TV shows out like that, you know, then fine, go watch something else. But Star Trek's a bit more than that. Star Trek's about, like I said, a social commentary on our world. And so you can't cut out a whole section of people, a whole group of people, because they exist in our world. So they should exist in the Star Trek narrative. So if they're making an argument that a gay relationship would disrupt viewing figures and would cause the show some sort of financial difficulty because it wasn't appealing to an audience that was going to, you know, pay money for it or whatever, then they're really on the wrong show. Does that make sense? I think then they should go work for something else. So
absolutely.
I don't know though whether, I mean, it's interesting just thinking of it in terms of the actors who've played these various roles. I mean, so you had someone like Dominic Keating who really didn't want to be pigeonholed into a gay part because that's not what he sort of wanted. I mean, there's also this sort of question like, do we expect because someone performs in Star Trek that we expect them to live up to kind of Star Trek ideals? Because someone like William Shatner arguably is not, you know, he's not Gene Roddenberry. Do you know what I mean? Like politically, he's coming from a very different place to probably the majority of Star Trek fans and to the majority of kind of Star Trek's messages in a sense. And I think you also, when it comes to sexuality, there's also this sort of question, assuming that I mean, obviously you might have gay actors playing straight roles. I mean, George Takei, if Sulu ever had a romance with a woman, would have, you know, presumably been in that situation. He'd have been expected to play that. I mean, I know it's interesting, say Terry Farrell, when they were filming Rejoined, I read an interview with her at the time and she said she found it quite difficult. And she found doing the kiss with the female, you know, with the other actress sort of emotionally difficult. She found it a difficult experience as an actor. And that's not so that she didn't think it was the right, creatively the right thing to do or whatever. And at the time, back in the 90s, I sort of thought, oh, come on, that's a bit pathetic. That's your job. Come on, get with the program sort of thing. But, on the other hand, that obviously was something that she felt was a challenge for her to sort of feel comfortable with it. And I think Garrett Wang as well, when there was that sort of question around the possibility that Harry Kim might be gay, because there was this big campaign called the Voyager Visibility Project that was pushing for a gay character in Voyager. He gave an interview where he sort of, without wanting to sound too negative about it, he sort of clearly didn't like the idea that Harry Kim might turn out to be gay. It wasn't really what he wanted. And it's interesting that with Discovery, we've got this gay couple, and of course, they're both played by gay actors, and that's been quite a big part of it. And they're not only, do they happen to be gay actors, my understanding is they're sort of quite well known in some ways for, like they both performed in Rent, for example, right? And they've both, I think, played gay roles before that have kind of had some kind of currency in a sense in the LGBT community in some way. So they've got that kind of, they've got gay credibility, I suppose, in a way that if you had a straight actor playing a gay character, maybe they wouldn't have that. And I'm just curious whether that influences things, whether that is, is it important that with Discovery, not only do we have these gay characters, but that we have gay actors playing gay characters? Does that make a difference somehow? Does that, because that adds a sort of an extra level of representation in a way.
Yes.
I mean, we had Zachary Quinto playing Spock. He's a gay actor, but he's not playing Slash, Kirk and Spock. He's not playing gay Spock, is he? He's playing a straight Spock. Does that sort of make a difference, bringing that in and having these gay actors playing these gay characters and sort of being aware of that, I suppose, in the material around the show as well as in the show itself? Yeah,
definitely. I think it does. I think you hit the nail on the head really there with saying, well, it's a double level of representation, because we're making the fact that these actors are gay visible as well. More gay people in the media that young people get to see when they're having questions about their sexuality, the better, because they can see it normalized, they can realize that it's okay and it's not something that they need to worry about, and so any representation that we can have there is great. So I think the visibility is the most important thing, the fact that it's something that's out there for people to see, being normalized, being treated as everyday. Absolutely. But I think as well, on top of that, I think they can bring something more to it, because they understand how to play that part in a way that, like you said, maybe Terry Farrell, even though she has no issues with people being gay, she's got no problem with anybody's sexuality. For her personally, it's a challenge for her to go and kiss a woman because she's not attracted to women. So for them to be able to do that in a way where they can be more comfortable with it makes the scenes more natural, and I think that also brings an element to it as well. So that's why I think it's a good thing.
I think what I would like to see just generally in television and film is more gay actors being given roles. And I agree with you. I think in Discovery, you're right. They bring their experience as like homosexuals to the roles themselves as well. So like, you're right, it's double representation. It's great because there's gay actors who are getting roles, whereas before maybe they wouldn't have had as many options role-wise because of discrimination in the industry. But also they're playing gay characters, which is great because then we're actually seeing gay characters on screen. But I'd also like to see more gay actors just getting roles altogether. And so an example of that is like in Lord of the Rings, well, in the Hobbit movies, I think there's 4 gay actors who play main characters, and they're not playing necessarily, I mean, their characters aren't necessarily sexual, because there's no real sexuality in Lord of the Rings, let's be honest. So, we don't know whether these characters are gay or straight, and it's not really part of the storyline, but they're playing quite what I would say is what people would deem to be kind of straight type characters, like masculine, fighting, very sort of like what you were saying, very male type characters. And the actors themselves are gay. And I think that's great because people aren't judging their sexuality, they're judging their quality of their acting, which is kind of what you want eventually. You want to get to a point where it doesn't matter and everybody's treated as an individual. And there's so much representation on screen and there's just so much diversity that you're treating the person as a character and a person rather than saying, oh, that's a gay actor or that's a gay person or that's a black actor or that's a black person. You want to get to the point where everybody has their role and everyone's story is told, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just wondering whether there's an element of, what we've seen in Star Trek before has been where we've had kind of same-sex representation. We've had, we had, say, in Rejoined with the two women. We had, Clara touched on earlier with the mirror universe. We have Esri Dax and the Intendant. We have the Intendant kind of flirting with Kira and so on. And there's problematic elements of that. Something like that, it sort of feels like you can have the potential for these lesbian characters, but there's a kind of sexiness attached to it in a way. Whereas I think with the male characters in Discovery, it's not represented as kind of as sexy in that sense. It is more kind of romantic. It is more kind of just like a normal relationship. And I'm sort of wondering, how long are we going to wait before we see a female same-sex relationship on Star Trek that is not, in a sense, playing towards a male audience or playing up the kind of sexiness of it, but is a bit more, feels a bit more real? Because, and does it matter to say that yes, we've got gay representation now, but actually, we've got gay representation for gay men. Have we got gay representation for gay women? Or do you know what I mean? Because it's not necessarily the same. I mean, you might be identified with, gay women might feel identified with gay men to a certain extent because of being part of the same marginalized group, but at the same time, it's a very different experience, very different stories there. And, how long do we have to wait for that issue to be dealt with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people, when a gay male couple were revealed to be being put into Discovery, that a lot of people are like, oh, that's great, because, normally they put the women in because the women are somehow more acceptable because it's the straight male audience watching it, and somehow they find women kissing more acceptable than men kissing, for reasons that I'm not going to go into in detail, but I think we all know. But you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of representation, in inverted commas, of gay women in media, certainly in the past, not necessarily so much now, but certainly in the past, has appeared to be representation, but isn't really, because it's just titillation for men. It's not about representing the women and their relationships, and the script has been written by men. It's their vision of what women's relationships look like when two women are in a relationship. It's not what, the women who maybe are in those relationships in reality haven't had a lot of input into that. It doesn't necessarily look like what they recognize their relationships to be like, and it's very sexualized, and it's very, played up for men to watch. So that is a problem, because it makes it look like there's a lot of representation for gay women in media, and there isn't as much as there might appear to be, because it's actually written for men and not written for women. I agree that is a problem. Now, looking back into the history of Star Trek, I don't necessarily think that Star Trek has that problem, in that it's written for titillation in that way, but I think that it does suffer from the problem of, well, we'll put the women in because that's more acceptable. I definitely think that that's what we've seen in the past. And in the mirror universe, yeah, maybe there is a bit of, oh, look, the women are kissing in there. I don't get that from Rejoined. I don't feel that in Rejoined at all. That feels quite natural to me. And I'd be interested to see what input they had from gay women in writing Rejoined, because that feels a lot more natural to me than, say, the mirror universe stuff, which is very much written to the, oh, look, the girls are kissing. Ooh. So I agree. I would like to see representation on both sides of the fence, but also, we need to see representation of bisexual characters, because bisexual erasure and bisexual invisibility is a massive problem in society, where people are read to be the sexuality of whatever relationship they're currently in. So if they're in a relationship with somebody of the opposite sex, they're read to be straight. If they're in a relationship with somebody of the same sex, they're read to be gay. And actually, that's not necessarily the case. So the invisibility of people who are bisexual is a problem, which is why I think as well with Rejoined, because we're seeing Dax having this relationship potentially with a woman, and we know that she's also had relationships with men, that is a good thing. And even though there are some issues in Rejoined, I think it actually does a great job in a lot of ways. And also in the mirror universe as well, we see the Intendant but she's kind of omnisexual. I think she'll just sleep with whoever she feels like sleeping with at the time. So I'm not sure it's a great example, but
she seems like a bit of a kind of pervert anyway.
Yeah.
She's so, she's like got every kind of sort of,
she's
kinky,
a love the one you're with kind of woman.
She's a vamp. Do you know what I mean? Exactly. Yeah. She's, so it's kind of, I don't know, it sort of cheapens all of that.
It does.
Aside from the sort of titillating element of it, it makes it all seem both ridiculous and kind of sinister at the same time, if you know what I mean. Her sexuality is such a sort of absurd performance that it's kind of, I'm not sure it's really doing anything all that positive.
So, moving on to Discovery now, on the latest 2 episodes, I have read a lot of criticism of the last 2 episodes online because of the fact that, obviously, spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Discovery, go and watch Discovery and then come back and listen to the rest of this podcast.
Yeah.
But because of the fact that Culber was killed by Ash Tyler, stroke Vok, and also because now it turns out that Stamets is, if not dead, he's basically in some sort of mental coma, otherworld ether type place.
Mm-hmm.
So basically one gay character has been made immobile and the other one's been killed. I've read the criticism that this is like a trope of what happens to gay characters across television and film. I think they call it bury your gays.
Bury your gays. Yeah,
exactly. And so what do you guys think of that? Do you think this is actually the case of that, or is it, do we have to wait and see?
Okay, so I understand the reaction, because we have to take the reaction in context. And the reaction is in the context of the fact that Star Trek, as much as I love it as a show, has systematically failed for 50 years to give us gay representation. As much as we've had all these little hints and, they've tried and they've waved at it, but they've never done it, not properly. And the fact that they've completely failed to do it, and then they've just started to do it, and they've given it us in a really great way, and they've handled it really brilliantly up to now, and then they drop the ball in a way that there's no way that the people who are writing that show are not aware of that trope. And I absolutely accept the fact that there is plot to come that may make this better than it currently appears. However, they must have anticipated this reaction. They must have been aware of how this would be perceived. And if they didn't, they're incredibly naive, is all I've got to say, because if we'd had loads and loads and loads of gay characters in Star Trek and some of them had been happy and some of them had not been happy and then this had happened, it wouldn't have been as much of an issue. And to kind of address a few comments that I've seen, like around the Babel conference and other places, it doesn't mean we can't kill the gay characters. That's not what this is about. This is about every time we have a gay couple that appears to be in a happy relationship, we have to ruin it because being gay is deviant and we have to, they can't possibly end up happy, because how could we show them as happy? Because that's just normalizing it and saying that it's okay. So the fact that Star Trek's just not done that for so long, and then they've now done what a lot of people feel like is a betrayal, that is why it is a problem. Now, personally, I am prepared to reserve judgment and wait to see what they're going to do, because I know that there might be plot things that might happen with it. But even having said that, I still do think that it's a little bit disappointing what they've done. Now, I really hope they come up with an awesome plot reason why they had to do this and they explain it all and it's all fine, but we'll see.
And I suppose the issue is we have this kind of, as you say, this kind of 50-year history of being let down, in a sense, by Star Trek. Do you know what I mean? Especially on this issue, and maybe on some other issues as well. But, this is something that they have talked about, having gay representation on Star Trek for so long, and failed to do it, and failed to do it, and failed to do it. And personally, I have to say, I felt even, say, with Beyond, there was an element of a letdown there, because I feel that they'd sort of talked it up as this big thing. And actually, the way it was shot in that film is so... I mean, there's one thing for kind of making it seem natural and not a big deal, but I feel like they made it such a small deal that actually it could go over the heads of a large proportion of the audience who weren't primed for it. And I did sort of wonder whether the way they shot it was also to do with... I know there were some issues about, because they were filming in a very conservative country, and obviously these are films that have to sell abroad and so on. It sort of felt like they were really doing it in the least... Like the impulse in terms of the script was obviously good, but the way the film kind of handled it, I felt was slightly... again, a bit conservative, a bit kind of cautious. And so I suppose maybe that's part of it with Discovery. I mean, it's difficult, I think, for people who aren't sort of invested in that sort of issue to understand the visceral response, maybe. Because so to me, it didn't... I mean, I was shocked when the Doctor died, although actually, to be honest, I'd worked it out from, accidentally absorbing spoilers on Twitter that I was trying not to read. So I was kind of expecting something like that to happen, but I still found it shocking. But it didn't sort of activate this whole level of feeling let down, of feeling distressed, of feeling kind of, some people felt very sort of traumatized by it almost, I think. I mean, Andy Vanderkolk wrote a really interesting blog post on this issue, which I'd recommend anyone to go and read if they're interested in this subject. After that, I think she was saying she'd got kind of backlash from people saying, well, I didn't have an issue with this or whatever. And I suppose, like, personally, I didn't have an issue with it, but I can sort of see, if given the strength of feeling that other people have had to it, and I can understand, like you say, if you understand the context, you can kind of appreciate that.
Yeah.
I do think it's a strange decision, and it's particularly strange given that the showrunner is a gay man. As you say, they're very tapped into all of this stuff. It's not like they're They're not just like blundering around and they don't know what they're doing. They were aware there was going to be crisis management that they would have to do in order to run this storyline. So,
well, exactly, because Wilson Cruz, I didn't actually see it myself, but I do believe that Wilson Cruz actually said some stuff about it immediately afterwards on After Trek, which means that they knew he knew what the reaction was going to be. They were aware of what the reaction was going to be. So I'm hoping that the payoff is going to be so awesome that we can understand why, despite the fact that they knew what the reaction was going to be, that they still chose to do it.
So I didn't have as much of a visceral reaction, I would imagine, than somebody from the LGBT community, but that's because I'm not a member of the LGBT community, but I can totally understand the visceral reaction that people had. This is something that's been on my mind recently because, and I won't go into spoilers, but I'm a big fan of the X-Files, and there's been things that have been happening in the X-Files and the new series of the X-Files that I have had a visceral reaction to. There's ideas that have been introduced that have actually been, I would say, offensive and distressing to me as a woman. And I have to say, I have found them offensive, and I have found them, I have had a visceral reaction to that. And I've thought, and there's been the same situation, like showrunners and actors and people have been like, no, wait, just like reassuring people on Twitter, like, don't worry, it's all going to work out at the end. There'll be a bigger payoff at the end. But I feel there's a certain responsibility when you're making creative decisions in a TV series, especially when you have a huge number of fans who are from groups of people who these creative decisions are going to upset. Like if you make a decision to like kill off a gay character, it's going to upset the gay community. If you make a decision to show the abuse of a very favoured beloved female character, it's going to piss off the female fans. You make these creative decisions and then it's sort of like you retcon them later on. It's like it's okay because unless
because XYZ.
Yeah. And I think, but actually you can't really retcon something like that. It's still shit later on. It's just that you're saying that at the end of it is going to lead to some sort of bigger, more profound message at the very end. And I think the problem is we don't always trust writers of TV shows, especially when the series is short, when it's like an event series. So especially when it's only a certain amount of episodes, you think, how can they resolve this in the time they have left? So I think that's a worry.
But also, I think maybe it ties into the fact that it's an odd situation. Although we watch Discovery on Netflix, it's not like House of Cards where they drop the whole season at once, because it is it's not even being, I don't know why, for whatever reason, they're doing it a week at a time, even though it's not being broadcast, they're doing it a week at a time. But at the same time, they're doing a short season that they have planned out from beginning to end, and probably, I don't know if they have it all written from beginning to end, but they have it planned out in a lot of detail compared to, say, previous Star Treks where they're kind of, when there's serialization, they're kind of make it up on the fly, Enterprise's indie arc. I think you can kind of see from the way that story is written, a certain amount of kind of scrambling and thinking, well, what the hell do we do here? And how do we get from this place to that place? And, trying to work it out on the spot. And I think, so they can say, well, we've got this all planned out for this whole season. It's all very cleverly structured and it's all going to work and so on. But the fact is they are releasing it week after week and they are going to have this kind of temporary issue. But I also think it's a very strange situation to be in where, if you think about, with Spock and when they killed off Spock in the Wrath of Khan, there was all these attempts to kind of trick people into thinking they weren't killing off Spock so that the impact would be stronger when he dies. So, they have that bit at the beginning where he appears to die, there's a sort of fake out death. Now we've got sort of almost the opposite where they go for this big drama of apparently killing a major character.
Oh, it's okay.
And then they walk it back immediately and they're like, oh no, we didn't really kill them. That seems a very strange situation to be in creatively, to basically say, oh yeah, that thing that you found really moving and shocking and made you gasp. Yeah, that didn't, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just, there's a reset button around the corner. And it's like, that seems a weird position to put yourself in, that you do something
very much so
for kind of impact, and then because the impact is actually quite negative, you have to kind of minimize what you've already done creatively. It seems like they've walked themselves into a strange box, but I guess it's true. We'll have to wait and see.
It does.
Where that storyline goes.
It does.
And how it resolves itself.
And I am prepared to wait and see what they're going to do, and maybe the payoff will be worth it, but it does seem to me a very odd creative decision to potentially jeopardize the first bit of real gay representation we've ever had on Star Trek. I think that's a very odd creative decision to take, personally. But I didn't probably have quite as visceral a reaction to it as a lot of people, but I did immediately have a reaction of knowing exactly what the reaction was going to be.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting choice, so we'll just have to wait and see where it goes.
Well, it seems like in true kind of 90s Star Trek fashion, we've ended on a bit of a downer here with our discussion of LGBT representation in a way that probably if we'd recorded this, a fortnight ago, we'd have been on a bit of a high. But I mean, why don't we turn things around a bit? Why don't we think about the future? Why don't we think about what would you two like to see? Or even let's look at it in two ways. What would you like to see more of in the future? But also, because we have talked a bit about missed opportunities, if you could go back into the past and change certain aspects of how Star Trek's engaged with this issue, what would you go back and change?
Oh, that's a difficult one. In terms of going back and changing, I mean, really, we just needed to see all of this so much earlier. I think Deep Space Nine, looking at the timings and sort of when things were going on, I suspect Next Gen was just a tiny little bit too early. And I know with the timing of Brookside in the UK, which was about 94, that was around about the end of Next Gen. So I think that would have been a bit too soon. So I think Deep Space Nine, especially with the way that it was sort of more playing with the sort of set way of doing television, and it was pushing the envelope in terms of storytelling and the way that it brought in all of these secondary characters, and everybody was a bit more grey and ambiguous, and we didn't really have good guys and bad guys in quite the same way. That I think they would have been the perfect platform for us to do something like that, because they were pushing the envelope in so many other areas that it just would have made sense, and the timing was perfect for it. So maybe with the whole Rejoined storyline, we could have played with something more there. I mean, the Trill to me are just fascinating in terms of their potential for us to talk about gender issues, about sexuality issues. I mean, are they all bisexual? Do they consider themselves to be transgender? I mean, essentially, realistically, they are transgender because they've been different genders throughout the life of the symbiont. They have memories of the previous hosts. So really, that's your perfect transgender issue right there to sort of bring in and talk about and address. And the Trill are just so fascinating. So the fact that we didn't do that is kind of disappointing, but maybe we can bring the Trill back in Discovery, and maybe we can have some Trill characters, and maybe we can talk more there about all of these types of gender and sexuality issues and all these interesting grey areas where, well, actually, maybe it's not all just about are you X or are you Y? It's all about, well, it's a spectrum and people fall at all different points on that spectrum. And I think they're a great vehicle for exploring that. So I think I'd like to see the Trill come back and for us to play a lot more with that.
I think I would have included a gay couple on Voyager. And I think I also, because you could explore a gay couple and their experience as being gay, but you could also explore the idea of couple that were together and far from home. And I mean, that would be an interesting idea. So a couple that had met on Earth and started out their relationship on Earth, had gone through Starfleet, or had met in Starfleet and thought they were going on a short mission, and then, so maybe they were a new couple. They just got together, and now they're on this long mission where they were stuck together for years. And how does that work? And you could have made them gay, and it would have been fine. That's what I would have liked to have seen.
Oh well, in a parallel universe.
Imagine if there were like two exes who were like divorced and they ended up on Voyager and they had to spend the time together for 7 years. That would be amazing.
Imagine the sexual tension.
Isn't that basically the Orville? Isn't that the premise of the Orville? Well, I think what I would quite like seeing is just looking. I mean, I think I'd love to see both those things in an ideal parallel universe version of Star Trek in the 90s. But I would quite like to see, and this is something that Discovery could do, this character from those novels that I was talking about, Burgoyne 15, he, she, it has a peculiar name as well. Really kind of playing with this idea of sort of alien sexuality and something that may be very foreign, very different to us. Star Trek is able to play with that. I mean, Clara, you were saying that, you see Odo as not necessarily entirely a gendered being, but I mean, they could have gone with that. They could have, they could have played that a bit more. And Star Trek could do more to kind of explore these characters. We've had a lot of these episodes dealing with, say, androgynous characters, but what we get is cogenitor. We get a woman who is made up to look a bit like David Bowie, basically, and that's our kind of idea of what androgyny is represented by. Star Trek could do more. Star Trek could do more to do more kind of creative, more unusual, more interesting, more kind of thought-provoking things. with these issues. And maybe that's something to look forward to in future. Well, Kay, it's been great having you on the show this week to talk about LGBT representation in Star Trek. If the listeners want to hear more of you on the Trek FM network or to get in touch with you on the internet, what's the best way for them to find you?
Well, if they want to hear more of me on Trek FM, they can hear me on To The Journey, which is our Star Trek Voyager podcast, along with my co-hosts there, Zach and Suzanne. If they want to look me up on Twitter, my handle there is Choco Weeble, and they can always find me in the Babel Conference.
Well, it's been fun talking about LGBT representation in Star Trek from the 90s through to the present day. But that's not the only thing that we have been talking about on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to everything else you might have missed on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Standard Orbit.
This episode is one of those tropes. Like, why is Jack the Ripper something that just completely still captivates us in storytelling?
It's interesting. People are always obsessed. Like, you always see some new documentary on the History Channel, like, we found the new Jack the Ripper. Was Jack the Ripper a woman? Was Jack the Ripper a political figure? Was he a part of the royal family? It's like, do we care at this point?
The 602 Club.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I love the fact that the theme of PTSD carries through, and the very first thing that they do is they throw at you, they double underline, circle, and bold the point that revenge doesn't chase the demons away.
Earl Grey.
I dragged him over to Seth MacFarlane, who had never met before, and I said, so you're a big Star Trek Next Gen fan? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm Lieutenant Commander Shelby. And he looked at me and he went, that means you're Elizabeth Dennehy. I suppose that's why someone like you sits in the shadow of a great man, passing off one command after another. He started saying all of my lines to me. And we started doing all of our scenes and lines. Isn't that hilarious?
Warp 5.
The Guardians are the Borg.
That's it. The Guardians are the Borg.
Tune in later on. We might talk about it.
Let's write that episode together. All right.
See, but the thing is that these sphere builders, though, like they must think of themselves as the Guardians of the Galaxy.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.